So Dan Ryan, thanks again for joining us today. We've been talking about religious freedom and human rights in China. What I'm really fascinated to know, and we just started touching on it in the last segment, is what are the similarities that you're seeing as a frequent traveller between the two countries? Native Australian, lived in Asia for 15 years, dealing very much on the social rules and business and market freedoms, regulations level of both societies as a lawyer. Do you see any changes in Australia? Are we moving towards a freer society, or are we moving towards something that's starting to resemble a communist country?
I think the interesting question, I mean, I've met a lot of government officials, both Australian and Chinese ones, and the question I increasingly ask myself is that when they're sitting across the table from each other, how do they actually philosophically disagree? I mean, China has, it's a big country, it has a different history, it has all sorts of different kind of problems. But if you apply a particular philosophy to particular problems, you get a particular result. So, and increasingly I find that Australian bureaucrats aren't able to articulate how they would rule differently. They simply don't understand. And, I met members of the Reserve Bank in Australia. I remember asking one of them, when you meet your Chinese counterpart, Zhou Xiachuan from the PBOC, how do you economically, disagree? And they don't have an adequate response. The response was like, "Oh, he's such a nice guy. He's a smart guy." Well, that's not an answer. And similarly, when you meet, I mean, everyone likes to think, "Oh, well, China, they don't believe in freedom of speech, and we believe in freedom of speech in Australia." And but if a Gillian Triggs goes to and sits across from her counterpart in China, she wants to maintain a harmonious society in Australia and will restrict the ability of people, as she, subjectively sees fit according to the sort of framework that's laid out, to stop people expressing themselves in order to preserve this harmonious society. Well, I mean, China has a slogan, a harmonious society. They often the government officials talk that way. Oh, we need to create a harmonious society. We don't need this troublemaker, writing these things, because it's off message. It's not in sync with the policy of the state. So, there's those type of levels. And similarly,
there's another ideology creeping around the world which basically suggests that harmony and peace is achieved by submission.
Yeah, they come at it from a different angle, but I mean, China has, the best way to think about it is it's
Well, I think Gillian Triggs comes from that perspective.
Technocratic rule, right? I mean, she's more a technocrat. She's not I think you're getting it like Islamic type, but she's not that. But she's more like a cold technocrat that thinks,
her expertise qualifies her to tell us what to do.
Rule by experts, and China thinks of themselves as rule by experts. We're ruling this country in a scientific way. Look how troublesome and crazy those Americans and Australians, and how much trouble they get into with all their sort of rambunctious democracy. And there's a grain of truth to that. Democracies can go off the rails to a certain degree, But at the same time, they're the best system for all, except for all the others. And so also they're not impartial. The rule by these experts, they have their own particular things. Why, for example, can't you, write an article in the thing? Why, for example, in the mainstream publications criticising particular, personal lives or others of the leaders? Yeah. Why can't you, for example, have a nativity scene on Tiananmen Square? They have Christmas lights and a bit of jingles and stuff, but you don't get...
Do they have Santa Claus?
No, all that sort of commercial stuff they have, but they don't get like in, Dan Andrews' Victoria, they're restricting on carols with an overtly religious character to them, right? There's no baby Jesus in the middle of Tiananmen Square.
Jingle Bells is fine.
Jingle Bells is very borderline. Yeah, it's dangerous territory you're going there.
Wow.
So they're the type of parallels I'm talking about. Or similarly, there are no true Catholic schools in China, or even evangelical Christian schools. It's all state-run. And similarly, in places like Australia, in Victoria especially, there's increasing control over those type of organisations. They don't like them, or they only like them if they're in sync with government policy. Yeah. So they're the type of parallels. Now, China's not Australia or the rest of it, but but there are certain assumptions that are creeping in, I think, to people's thinking, and it'd be well worth many, people in the political class and the bureaucratic class in Australia just reflecting on that. I mean, if you're sitting across the table and you can't adequately talk through what the differences are, then you're not really understanding things, right?
It sounds like you're describing that our leaders have become almost, and our bureaucrats and officials, Reserve Bank members, and it sounds like they're wanting to rule by popularity instead of by value. Paradigm, philosophy.
They don't need to go, Xi Jinping isn't one for selfies and Twitter accounts. It's not that type of popularity.
Xi Jinping?
He's the leader, president of China. Xi Jinping is the leader of China,
right.
And president of China.
Yep.
And so there's not that type of popularity contest, but no, they think of themselves much more like, a wise group of experts ruling the country according to particular dictates. And the trap that many foreign, politicians or others go to China and they always say, oh, they're so pragmatic, the Chinese, pragmatic. Well, pragmatic. And then often they add a little bit of, the famous Deng Xiaoping saying that it doesn't matter whether it's a black or white cat as long as it catches the mouse, or it, that type of thing. But then think to yourself, I mean, what type of nonsense are you talking? I mean, so you believe it's pragmatic to then lock up people and make them disappear? You believe it's pragmatic not to what does that actually mean? It's a nonsensical statement. If there was a bit more reflection, they'd think through. Because everyone's all about, in the public discourse in Australia, we need to understand China better, we need to understand this, and all the rest of it ad infinitum. But true understanding is about working out what the differences are, like to clarifying the differences. That's the first step to sort of actually create understanding. And it's not the cultural stuff. I mean, everyone loves, Chinese food and, sing the songs. It's all very good. It's part of, big civilization, part of humanity, all the rest of it. But there's a political wash to that system, which is different to Taiwan, it's different to Hong Kong, different to Japan. Japan doesn't lock up its political dissidents, it's a genuinely free press. It's not, it's not cultural misunderstanding there. It's recognizing the political, the political slant to it all.
So do you think, let me think of a couple of examples. Andrew Bolt being prosecuted for offending people in his journalism and being found guilty.
Yeah.
Is that a symptom of social creep towards totalitarianism?
You can overstate it, but I can certainly think of examples where he would be considered, a troublemaker in China, because he would be, asking fairly direct questions of public administration. I mean, that's what that really should have been about. Is it right that public funds are used to directed towards who identify as a particular race, right? So China has its own, there's multiple minorities and stuff in China, and that still is the excuse they use. Oh, we need to create this sort of harmonious society, and for Andrew, you're not really helping, or Andrew Bolt equivalent, you're not really helping. You're messing things up, and don't you know that the economic interests of it's not going to build any roads. It's not going to build any roads. It's not that important. This freedom of speech thing. It's not going to kind of build bridges to Zhuhai or the rest of it. Yep. It's not. It's similarly like this. These Christian organisations and what have they're not really all about like economic development, or if they push it too much, then they kind of just upset the apple cart.
Can you think of any other examples of it in Australia? You mentioned before that the lack of freedom was more observable in the things you don't see.
Yeah. I mean, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. I mean, life issues is a big one. If you asked a Chinese leader of the Chinese Communist Party about abortion, euthanasia, and the rest of it, they're not going to be in the trenches for you on any of those things, right? They're not going to be an advocate for those things. And similarly, they might, there'll be some restrictions on same-sex abortion. In many cases, in some cases,
actually, gender selection.
Yeah. In some cases, it's more stringent than there is in Australia. But they're never going to be. There's no religious there's no one in the public square who, in China at least, who is going to be accepted making those arguments about those issues. Now, you do see that, I think, in certain situations in Australia, that the government and political class is happy for the churches to be, like I said, in the little box. But as soon as they venture outside of that and make those type of arguments, they're not locked up, but they're certainly de-emphasized, sidelined, put in their place. Maybe they won't be invited to, interfaith harmony days or what have, right? So, it's not like, again, I'm not saying that China is the same as Australia. What I'm trying to say is that recognize that China is not North Korea, but Australia is not what it once was either. Australia is not as strong in exercising its traditional freedoms of religious speech and the rest of it as it once was, as it once took for granted. And at some point you reach a level where China gets a bit better, Australia gets a lot worse, and neither are really quite satisfactory.
I've got lots of examples popping through my head. The government creating a regulation where somebody can be prosecuted for not keeping the harmony. And that's crazy.
Well, think of an economic point. I mean, a few years back, we were going to think about setting up an independent panel to determine the carbon tax level in Australia, headed up by all the lovelies who also, some of them Reserve Bank members. Now, because we need an expert panel, we can't have this politicized. It needs to be done in a scientific way. I mean, that's how the Beijing guys think.
Wow.
And what they're doing is they're removing tax-making power from the national parliament, which is what ancestors in Australia fought for.
Relocating power from elected officials.
That's right, and there are a lot, and often that's the solution that's proposed by many people. Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. They move it. If it gets in the too hard basket, the classic thing is we'll put it into an expert panel to decide. We'll move that out of an expert panel. And so the politicians have become a bit of a circus show, whereas all of the decisions are made by expert panels. Well, again, that's not how it's meant to work. It's meant to be a rolling debate in Parliament where people make the decision. That's what we elect people to do. Yeah. We don't have the situation where this democracy is kind of sidelined, and you have all these groups which you don't have the power to. How do I vote off Gillian Triggs? How do I vote off carbon taxing authority? It's impossible, right? So what are you exercising when you vote? You're sort of electing a nice guy or gal who is your local member to look after the garbage and the sort of stuff in your local district.
Another thing that we didn't mind, that went missing. And it's just the de-Christianizing of culture. And Cory Bernardi started a petition to change it, which a lot of people didn't get his motivation, which was taking the word Easter off chocolates, which were there to celebrate the occasion. And all of a sudden it became an innocuous, meaningless commercialisation of a calendar event instead of having any meaning or significance whatsoever.
Well, there's a lot of that. And again, I keep saying it's important when you're in China to look for what's missing. I mean, in Hong Kong, for example, you have cenotaphs with the Chinese people who fought as part of the Allies during World War I, World II, etc. And it has that known unto God inscription.
In Australia.
And in Hong Kong. And Australia too, right? But you don't see that in mainland China. And remember, there was that Frahori a couple of years back where they were removing the known unto God from the Australian National War Memorial. And then there was a bit of controversy with that. There's this like you said, de-Christianizing, but taking all those sort of symbols. There's always the brouhaha at the beginning of Parliament where the Greens object to the reading of the Lord's Prayer. So you don't get the Lord's Prayer being read at the beginning of the Chinese People's National Congress, right? Yeah. And yet, like Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of the Republic of China, and Chiang Kai-shek were both nominally Christians. It's not as though it has been a foreign religious thing, or that the leaders of China haven't been that in the past. But at the moment, there'd be no Christian leader there's no one who's overtly Christian who's a member of the Chinese Communist Party.
Would it be fair to say, just to sum up, would it be fair to say that you don't see us becoming communists anytime soon? but the temperature of the water is slowly changing.
Yeah.
You need to be aware of it and vigilant against it.
Yeah, just if no one, look, it takes a lot of time to learn Chinese and all the rest of it. Chinese culture is an interesting thing, get into it. But everyday Australians can think about politically and, philosophically, what it means, how we are different. It's almost like a civics course, how we are different to China politically in that respect. What these changes, these subtle changes that bump up in the press from time to time, whether it's an Andrew Bolt or, known unto God being taken from the National War Memorial. They're not just sort of little bits. Oh, it's just a little brick here. It doesn't matter. This little brick here. Little brick here. Eventually, if you take too many of those bricks away, you do change the nature of your society. Yeah. Some people recognise that. Some people are deliberately doing that on purpose. Others just think it's kind of, going with the flow type of thing. I know we don't call it, the only people objecting to it are, have an agenda or, religious conservatives. No. You change the nature of the society if you change too many of those things dramatically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very good. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot more about China and Hong Kong and the freedoms that we enjoy and some that we're letting go without even knowing about it. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please like it and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'd love to keep you informed, so head over to churchandstate.com.au and subscribe to email updates. We can keep you in the loop. Also, we've got another great video I think you'd love right there.